Dan Kenner took a sip of bourbon and picked up his iPhone. He received a message from his wife saying that she was working late again and that he should have dinner himself. Dan was a man who loved to plan. Since the evening was free, Dan decided to eat a cheeseburger and spend the evening with Lee Child's latest novel, Jack Reacher, and a bottle of 13-year-old bourbon given to him by his father-in-law. He was bottled up for the coming moment, and this evening promised to be such a moment. Dan took another sip of bourbon and placed the tablet on the end table, enjoying the amber 111 proof liquid and reflecting on his current situation. Kendall, Dan's wife of 6 years, has been working overtime for the past 6 months. At the beginning of their marriage, they agreed to put an equal amount into a joint checking account each month to pay bills and fund vacations, but personal savings, checking and retirement accounts were kept completely separate, and neither had access to each other's accounts. As an employee, Kendall's income was not increased by additional hours, so whether Kendall worked 40 hours a week or 60, her income remained the same. With separate personal accounts, Dan didn't know whether Kendall was earning a little or a lot from her overtime hours. The amount they each contributed to the joint account was far more than was required to cover expenses, and the balance grew significantly. Kendall insisted on such a division of accounts even before their wedding. When he and Kendall first met, Dan's business was struggling due to the bad economy, and there would be weeks and months when Dan would refuse to pay himself. This is the nature of business. The cleaner gets paid before you do. Dan refused to lay off employees and dug deeper and deeper into his personal savings to keep his promise to himself that no one would lose their job. He moved through life step by step, and when night fell, he closed his workshops, and all he discovered was that he was another day older and even deeper in debt. Kendall earned a decent salary as a staff accountant for a Fortune 500 company and stayed out of Dan's business. She was afraid that his company would fail at this time and kept her at arm's length. During these difficult years, Dan lived off savings so as not to burden Kendall, and although he sometimes found it difficult to meet his obligations to fund their joint account, he could always put his share into it, knowing that the storm would eventually pass. Dan was able to not only weather the storm, but thrive. The collection of 3 auto repair shops he inherited from his father has grown over the past few years into a small chain of 12 locations. In the next 3 years, he acquired options on land, which will allow him to increase the network to 20 points. All workshops were working in the red, but Dan deliberately kept his salary as low as possible and plowed profits back into the business. For each point, tire-fitting equipment was purchased, capable of installing and balancing tires of any size on any type of wheel, regardless of their exotic nature. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment allowed his technicians to diagnose and correct drivability problems in almost all vehicles manufactured in North America, Asia, and Europe, except France, because fuck a lot of Peugeots. So Dan's business was in full swing. Kendall's work was going well. This should have been the happiest time of their lives, but cracks appeared in their marriage. This was Dan and Kendall's second marriage. Dan's first wife was killed when she was hit by an elderly woman driver while out on her morning jog. It was a clear, sunny morning with a slight October chill in the air. Due to the morning glare, an elderly woman driving to her doctor did not notice Kendall running down the street. The city was repairing a damaged culvert, which destroyed the sidewalk and forced Lizzie to run several meters across the roadway. That was all that was required. 20 damn feet. 5 seconds of running, and 2 lives cut short. Lizzie didn't know it yet, but she was 4 weeks pregnant when she was hit by a car. This was the second tragedy in the Kenner family. Dan's mother died of lung cancer when he was in high school. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life when she developed a persistent cough and sought medical help. 8 weeks after her diagnosis, she was gone. It took several months before Dan could begin to recover from Lizzie's death. His father appointed acting manager of the workshop that Dan ran. This gave Dan time to grieve for the wife and child he would never have. Dan might never have recovered if his father had not suffered a fatal coronary attack while driving home from his workshop that evening. This made Dan forget about his pain and focus on business. People's livelihoods depended on it. It was because of a careless accident that Dan met Kendall. The mechanic's apprentice removed the radiator cap without waiting for the engine to cool as Dan walked by. Hot antifreeze splashed onto Dan's chest, and he had to go to the emergency room. The emergency room waiting area was crowded with the type of visitors one would find in most cities. Open head wounds, overdoses, withdrawal symptoms, and a range of injuries characterized by what emergency personnel called BRIs, short for beer-related injuries. The place next to Dan was empty, and Dan himself did not look scary, although he looked as if he had been doused with some kind of greenish liquid, with a smell that was weak and unpleasant at the same time. A tall, attractive brunette limped over to Dan and sat down in the empty seat next to him. Since the emergency room there were a lot of people. They knew they would have to wait. They told each other about their injuries. Kendall sprained her ankle while jogging after work, and briefly talked about their lives. There was an immediate attraction between Dan and Kendall. Dan invited her to dinner, and she accepted. They became friends and very quickly became a couple. Kendall divorced her first husband because of his emotional abuse and infidelity, and from the first date she told Dan that she did not tolerate cheaters. They got married 15 months after they met. Dan took a sip of whiskey and thought about his marriage. What did the old joke say? We have been happily married for 5 years. Unfortunately, we got married 6 years ago. For the first few years of their marriage, Dan and Kendall were ecstatically happy. They laughed together. They were dancing. They made love constantly. They felt good together. The problems began after Kendall earned her MBA and was lured away from the bank she had worked at after college to work as an accountant for the Fortune 500 corporation she now worked for. Dan supported her. He wanted Kendall to be happy and successful. There came a time when one of the senior vice presidents was about to retire, and the senior director to whom she reported was applying for the position. The senior director position was vacant, and Kendall felt she had a very good chance of promotion. She just needed to show that she really wanted the job. A few months later, Dan noticed that Kendall was becoming unhappy with him. Nothing he did seemed right to her. Kendall began to disdain his work. To her, he was now just a mechanic, a monkey in grease, a nickname for auto mechanics. She began to speak disparagingly about him during every conversation. Her constant anger and irritation with her husband brought discord into their marriage. Kendall began working overtime to stay away from Dan. When she was home, she texted on her phone. Her phone. God, how he hated her phone. She was always on the phone. She secretly laughed at the incoming messages. She rotated the screen so that her husband could not see who she was texting or what the messages were about. I slept with my phone under my pillow, and then everything turned violent. Kendall has always had a quick temper and gets angry quickly. This usually resulted in a sharp remark or a sharp barb directed at the object of her anger. She was always quick to calm down and correct herself when her temper got out of control, and when Dan became the object of her anger, her repentance led to a magnificent scene at night. However, Dan noticed that her outbursts became more frequent and longer lasting, but without the bed, which in the past made her temper somewhat tolerable. A month ago, during an argument that Kendall started for no good reason, she slapped him. In 6 years of marriage, neither Dan nor Kendall ever did not raise a hand against each other, but she slapped him, and this shocked Dan to the core. The slap also surprised Kendall because she immediately apologized and asked for forgiveness. But then the coffee cup incident happened. A week after the slap, Kendall yelled at Dan because the oil change light on her BMW came on, and he didn't change it. Dan explained to Kendall, once again, that her BMW gets free service for the first 3 years, so there's no point in him changing the oil if the BMW dealer does it for free. Kendall yelled at Dan, "Just change the oil, idiot." Dan had enough of this nonsense. "I told you not to buy this car. but you just had to have this overpriced and unreliable piece of German crap. Now that you have it, you have to maintain it yourself. You make an appointment for service at a BMW dealer yourself. It's your concern." Kendall was furious. She picked up the coffee cup and threw it at Dan's head. If he had not dodged, the cup would have hit him squarely on the forehead. He stared at Kendall in shock. She answered him with an expressionless look, after which she turned on her heel and left without saying a word. Dan took another sip of whiskey. He heard the garage door open, signaling Kendall's return home. Dan picked up his cell phone and sent a message, as well as an email, which he queued. They were duplicates, sent to the same person and contained the same package of information, so it did not matter which one was received first, or if one of them did not arrive. Dan was a firm believer in backup plans. As Tennessee Ernie Ford sang long ago, "If the right one doesn't get you, the left one will." Walking through the living room, Kendall glanced at Dan, who was sitting comfortably in an easy chair with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I'm going to change my clothes, and then I need to ask you about the strange activity on the joint account." Kendall didn't wait for Dan's reaction to her statement and headed to the bedroom. A few minutes later, Dan heard the shower turn on. Both Dan and Kendall have their banking apps set to alert them for unusual activity. Dan received the same text notifications that Kendall was undoubtedly worried about. He sighed, took a sip of bourbon, and set the tablet aside, waiting for Kendall to return. She returned 15 minutes later, wearing black yoga pants and a midriff-bearing white t-shirt, and sat down on the couch across from Dan. Her wet hair was pulled back from her shower, and although she didn't wear any makeup, she was a stunningly beautiful woman. Her body was slender and athletic, capped by C-cup breasts that were currently not encumbered by a bra. "Do you know about these deductions from the joint account?" she asked. There was a slight accusatory tone in her voice. She handed Dan her cell phone. Their bank's app was open to check the activity of their joint checking account. The balance was $12, while the day before it showed more than $30,000. Dan nodded his head. $12,000 written off from PDSC? This is Pendragon Security Consultants. This is to pay them for following you for a month and documenting your affair with your boss. 18,000 ASN, bank transfer through the ASN network, Alchemy Pay, to the SKD account. This is the fee for Solomon, Klein, and Davis, my divorce attorneys. He took a sip of his bourbon and watched Kendall's reaction. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her mouth opened and closed like a fish in water, trying to find oxygen. Her face turned red, and for a moment, Kendall seemed speechless. Dan watched the emotions play on her face. Fear turned to sadness, which turned to anger, and then back to fear. She seemed stuck, and it wasn't until Dan raised his glass to take a sip of bourbon that she seemed to decide what to say. "It didn't mean anything," Kendall said. "I just got involved in something I couldn't control. I'll end this right now. I don't want to get a divorce. Didn't you say that you don't tolerate cheaters? What did this mean to you? If you ever cheated on me, I would divorce you," Kendall said, looking at her hands clasped in her lap. "That sounds like a smart plan," Dan said. "I don't want a divorce," Kendall repeated. "What do you think should happen when I find out?" Dan asked. "I didn't think you'd find out," Kendall answered honestly. "I thought that our romance would end and you and I would return to normal life. What about disrespect, anger, and violence? Should I have just forgotten about it? I never disrespected you." "And there was no violence," Kendall said, her voice rising slightly as she denied Dan's accusations. "Did you sleep with him in our bed?" Dan asked. Kendall gasped, and the blood drained from her face. "Yes," she said quietly, "but I didn't mean to disrespect you." "Oh, well, then everything is fine. If you didn't mean to disrespect me, then it's okay," Dan said with a hint of anger. "You slept with your lover in our marital bed, in our marital home, and you don't think that was disrespectful to me? And you say there was no violence? Dan laughed sardonically. You slapped me and threw a coffee cup at my head, so yes, it was violence. We can overcome this. I don't want to get a divorce, Kendall insisted. We can work things out. I'll make an appointment for us to see a marriage counselor. Dan shook his head. The problem was not in our marriage, but in your betrayal. I agree that counseling is necessary, but not to fix our marriage. You need to fix everything that's broken in you. If your boyfriend was single, you would leave here on the first puff of a cigarette. He's not going to get a divorce, so I'm your plan B. Well, to hell with this fuss. I don't want to get a divorce, Kendall repeated decisively. You'll change your mind, Dan said with a sarcastic smile. Kendall's phone buzzed with incoming notifications the entire time she and Dan were talking, but she ignored them in favor of Dan. When the incoming call came, she lowered her eyes irritably. You should probably answer, Dan said. Kendall rose from the couch and headed to the master bedroom for privacy. As she walked away, Dan picked up his phone, opened a few apps, and hit the send button. Dan heard Kendall's muffled voice, but could not understand her until she said loudly, "What did he do?" A few minutes later, Kendall returned to the living room. Her face was red and her eyes were narrowed and angry. "Did you tell his wife? You told his wife?" she screamed. "How dare you try to destroy his marriage? You have no right. They have 2 little boys. How could you hate her so much? You poor asshole. You pathetic piece of shit. I will never forgive you for hurting her like that." Dan looked at Kendall, puzzled. "So, in your opinion, he's not a wretched asshole for cheating on his wife. Am I a poor asshole for telling her what he configures? You have some bad logic, baby. Don't you consider yourself and your boyfriend to be happy pieces of shit for lying and cheating on your spouses and me as a bad guy for bringing this to light?" Dan shook his head and chuckled. In his quest to understand infidelity, he had recently read about the twisted logic of cheaters, but seeing it in his own wife was simply insane. "This concerns only you and me. You had no right to interfere in their marriage," Kendall shouted, her face turning crimson with anger. "Your boyfriend had no problem interfering in my marriage, so I have no problem interfering in his. If he cheats on her with a colleague, then it is unknown what sluts and whores he cheats with. She must protect herself and get tested for sexually transmitted diseases. He's not like that, and he's clean. Since the first thing you do when you get home from working late is take a shower, I'm guessing you're having unprotected sex with him. You should take the test, too. I checked for my peace of mind, although we have not been intimate since you started your affair." Kendall looked at her husband in shock. He had known about this for months, and he acted like everything was fine while he hired private detectives. Who was this man? You just wanted revenge. "You're pathetic," Kendall said. Dan noticed again that her phone was buzzing with incoming notifications, which she ignored while she hurled insults at him. As she paused to catch her breath, her phone rang. "You should probably answer," Dan repeated, taking another sip of bourbon. Kendall headed back to the master bedroom to answer the phone. Dan made a call on his iPhone and mumbled quickly into the phone. He then opened the recording app on his iPhone and leaned it against the lamp that sat on the end table next to the chair. The phone recorded video of Dan while keeping the line open so the person on the other end could hear what was happening on the other end of the line. Dan sat, leaning on his hands, and waited for his wife to return. He didn't have to wait long. Kendall practically flew into the living room. Kendall jumped over the space separating them and began punching him in the face. Dan felt his lips split, and the coppery taste of blood poured into his mouth. She hit him in the nose, and Dan's vision blurred for a moment. Finally, it got to the point where he stopped sitting with his hands on his hands and covered his face with his hands, while she continued to beat him. Kendall screamed, "I'll kill you, you bastard! I'm going to pull out a gun and blow your fucking head off." Eventually, Dan stood up and took a few steps away, gently pushing her away, leaving the couch between himself and Kendall. If the 911 operator Dan called did everything correctly, he would only have to wait a couple of minutes for the patrol car to arrive. That's exactly what happened. Kendall looked at Dan with eyes full of hatred. Her chest heaved as she took deep breaths. She was trying to figure out the best way to get to Dan. Left? On right? Over the top of the sofa? Before she could come up with a plan of attack, the doorbell rang. "You should probably open the door," Dan said, his voice flat and emotionless. Kendall wrinkled her nose and narrowed her eyes, looking into Dan's eyes. She paused and then turned on her heel and headed for the front door. Kendall opened the door and 2 police officers stood in front of her. She spoke to them, looking back at Dan every few sentences. The officers and Kendall were too far away for Dan to understand their mumbled conversation. He saw Kendall gesturing wildly and pointing her finger at him. Dan saw Kendall step aside and allow the officers to enter their home. She led one of the officers past the living room towards the kitchen. The second officer approached Dan. "Mr. Kenner, I am Patrolman Diaz, and my partner is Patrolman Agnew. Your wife said that you were cruel to her this evening. Why don't you tell me what's going on? Did you touch her?" Dan shook his head. "No, I confronted my wife about her affair. She attacked me." Dan pointed to his face. He felt blood on his face from the impact of a thrown cell phone. He also felt a split lip. "I was the one who called 911. Lately she has become aggressive. A month ago she slapped me, and a week later she threw a coffee cup at my head. I avoided it, but if not for this, I would have had to go to the emergency room. I recorded today's confrontation. Want to watch the video?" Patrolman Diaz definitely wanted to see the video. Dan made a few taps on his iPhone and then handed the phone to the police officer. Patrolman Diaz silently watched the video, raising his eyebrows at the scene of Kendall attacking Dan. The policeman looked at Dan skeptically. "It looks like there was a conversation before the recording. Was anything said that might have escalated the situation?" Dan shrugged. "She found out that a private detective had been following her for a month, and that I had conveyed the results of the investigation to her lover's wife. She wasn't happy about it." The policeman chuckled. "You don't do everything halfway, do you? As one guy said, I light my path forward with the light of the bridge fires burning behind me. Okay, Dylan McKay." The officer shook his head and smiled. His partner came out of the kitchen and they conferred with each other. The second officer shook his head and nodded in Dan's direction. Patrolman Diaz played the video on Dan's phone to his partner. His partner rolled his eyes and shook his head. Kendall's explanation was completely different, but she didn't know she was being recorded. Patrolman Diaz returned to Dan. "We are arresting your wife for domestic violence and terroristic threats. I suggest you file a restraining order." Patrolman Diaz opened the front door as his partner led Kendall out of the kitchen with her hands cuffed. She cried and began to choke. "Dan, don't let them do this to me. Please, if you ever loved me, make them let me go. I promise I'll be good." Dan rolled his eyes and turned to the officer, who handed him a business card. "My email address is on the card. Send me a copy of the video." As the squad car pulled away, Dan called his lawyer, Dwight Solomon. "Everything went exactly as I expected. She was simply arrested and taken to prison. Stay calm, Dan. If she shows up tomorrow, you know what to do." The next morning, as Kendall was leaving the courthouse, accompanied by her parents, she was stopped by a 20-year-old blonde chewing gum. "Sorry," she said, stopping in Kendall's path. "Are you Kendall Kenner?" "Yes," she answered. A very tired, hungry, and irritated Kendall Kenner. "Who you are?" "You've been served," the blonde answered, handing the shocked Kendall an envelope. The blonde smacked her gum and, turning her back to Kendall, walked away. "What kind of crap is this?" Kendall called out to the blonde from behind. "I don't know, I don't care," the blonde answered over her shoulder. "But I'd say you're probably screwed, whatever it is." Kendall angrily opened the paper and saw the inscription, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." "What a bastard!" she shouted to her parents. The morning turned out to be difficult. Kendall was woken up early and taken out of her jail cell before being taken to a holding cell in another part of the building. She sat in the cell for an hour before meeting with her lawyer. She had been allowed one phone call the night before, and she called her parents, who immediately began leaving voicemails at various law offices so they could start work the next day. They made an agreement with the first lawyer, who called them back the next morning and received assurances that Kendall would be represented at the hearing. The judge set Kendall's bail at $10,000, which meant she would either have to post the full amount or pay a surety 10% and then pledge the property as collateral. The judge also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from contacting her husband or going to his home or his place of work. She had to make arrangements with her lawyer to remove her belongings from the house. Kendall's lawyer objected to this, but then he was shown photographs of Kendall's husband. The objection was withdrawn. Coming out of the courthouse, Kendall's parents first took her through the drive-thru to McDonald's. She was booked into the Denton County Jail too late to eat dinner, and jailers woke her up early for a morning court appearance, so she missed breakfast. The night before, Kendall had skipped dinner, preferring to spend time in bed with her boss, Tony. She planned to snack on the leftover food from the refrigerator when she got home, but that plan failed. She wondered how she ended up here. She and Tony had just finished their second round of sex when the alarm on her phone started ringing. While Tony dozed next to her, she checked her phone, expecting to see a message from Dan. Instead, she saw a message from the bank about a low balance. She quickly logged into her bank's app and immediately saw that there were only a few dollars in the joint bank account. After lunch, 2 ASN withdrawals were received into the account, one for $12,000, the other for $18,000. A Google search for payment recipients turned up nothing. Kendall knew this could mean they had been ripped off, or that the bank had made a mistake. Kendall was a smart woman. She also realized that this could mean that Dan knew about her affair and emptied his checking account. However, she didn't believe it. She knew her husband and knew that he was not afraid of confrontation. If he suspected her of cheating, he would definitely tell her. Dan Kenner wasn't the kind of man to let something like that pass. She knew it, and yet here she was, lying next to her boss in a cheap motel after her dirty deeds, who was impressive in his mediocrity. Not for the first time, she wondered what she was doing here. Everything has always come easy for Kendall. She was always the most beautiful and smart girl in the class. She was rarely the most popular because the other girls didn't trust her. At an early age, she learned to use her charm as a weapon, and it was a weapon she pulled out without hesitation. It all started with Mr. Campbell, her high school math teacher. A few moves earned her an A+. By allowing Miss Donovan to caress her, she got an A in economics. She never dated high school kids, only men who had graduated from college and had good jobs. College was a repeat of high school. If she had problems with her classes, she slept with the professor, both men and women. They all wanted Kendall. She graduated from college in 4 years with a degree in finance. She considered law school, but knew she wasn't a strong enough student. You can't fight your way through a law school bed. For Kendall, her current affair with Tony Geyer, the senior director to whom she reported, meant nothing. It was a means to an end. If, in the process of promotion, she can get a little entertainment experience, which her previous love called bed sports, then so much the better. It was during her second year at Chase Bank that she met Kyle Evans. Kyle visited her bank branch as part of an investigation into possible money laundering activities of a suspected drug dealer. Kyle was assigned to the Denton County Sheriff's Department's Special Operations Division, and his long hair, mustache, and easygoing attitude immediately captivated her. She brazenly invited him out for drinks and climbed into bed with him at the end of their first date. For Kendall, bed was mind-blowing, and she went crazy for Kyle. 2 months later, they began to live together. A year later, they got married. For Kendall, married life was a revelation. She loved Kyle and wanted to do everything in her power to please him. homemade or bed, it doesn't matter. Kendall and Kyle were perfect together. Until it's over. They had been married for 4 years and were actively trying to have a child. They had no luck so far, but they enjoyed trying. Halfway through their 4th year of marriage, Kyle was asked to attend a 4-week course, organized by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Organization. Although he will be out for a month, having the ATF course on his resume will help Kyle with his promotion. It was not difficult to go. The first week of Kyle's absence, Kendall was lonely, but good. The second week was a little more difficult as the hormones combined with loneliness increased her arousal. By the end of the 3rd week, Kendall was crawling up the walls. In week 4, Kendall agreed to go out for drinks with Bill Williams. William Williams, known as Bill Squared, or more commonly, the Square, was her husband's former partner in the Denton County Sheriff's Department. Kendall didn't know exactly what led to their falling out, but she knew they were no longer friends. She accepted his invitation to drink with the vague idea that she could help overcome differences. Besides, he was a handsome man, and she was lonely. What could be worse? Kyle showed excellent results in the ATF class. He was at the top of the class, which was very important because in the last week, whoever came first got the opportunity to take the final exam 3 days earlier. If they passed the exam, they could leave early, and if they failed, they had to stay until the end of class. Kyle passed the exam, and 3 hours later he was on a plane heading to DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, to surprise his wife. It was 4 o'clock in the morning when Uber dropped Kyle off in front of his darkened home. In the driveway, he recognized the car of his former partner, Square. Kyle's heart clenched into a cold fist as he unlocked the front door and walked into the house he shared with Kendall. Leaving the suitcase at the front door, he quietly walked into the bedroom. The room was partially lit by light from the main bathroom. Square lay on his back, naked. Kendall was lying on her side, facing him, her arm draped across his chest. She slept with her husband in the same way. Kyle took out his phone and started filming the sleeping couple. After 30 seconds of shooting, he took a few pictures and put the camera away. Kyle then approached the bed from the Square side until tonight Kyle's side, and clasped his hands together, intertwining his fingers. Then he raised both hands above his head and brought them down with all his strength onto Square's groin. The piercing scream that escaped the Square's mouth woke Kendall from her dreamless sleep. When she woke up, she was scared and disoriented. She saw Bill crying and clutching his groin with both hands. She saw her husband standing over them, but for a moment her brain could not comprehend what was happening. And then everything fell into place. Kendall looked at her husband with a frightened expression on her face. She slowly realized the horror of what was happening. Her husband looked down at her. His face was red with rage as he looked at his soon-to-be ex-wife. "I'll be back at 3 to pick up my things. I'll be done by 6. Don't be here at this time. I won't be held accountable for my actions if I see you, and you're not worth going to jail or losing your job." Kyle grabbed Square by the hair and lifted his face to look into his eyes. "You're a pathetic piece of shit. I'll send a copy of the videotape to your wife and HR. You can go and quit today because your career is over and so is your marriage." Kyle gave him a final blow to his nose, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to draw blood. He turned and left the house, and Kendall sighed, remembering how hurt Kyle was because of her cheating. Her strong husband was devastated, and she feared he would never recover. He rejected all her attempts to contact him. He didn't want to see her or talk to her. The divorce took place, and her parents supported her, explaining that she was not to blame for anything. Kyle had to be very cruel to hurt Bill so much. His cruelty would sooner or later lead to the death of their marriage. Her story became one of neglect and abuse at his hands. Didn't he show his violent tendencies when he confronted Bill? As Kendall and her parents rewrote history, casting themselves as the victim, She became the hero of their story. A brave girl who did what she had to do to save herself from the brute that her husband had become. Only once were her inventions thrown in her face. Kendall was shopping at Engstrom's in Dallas when she came face to face with her ex-husband. With him was a tall, slender woman. She had red hair and an athletic build. She seemed vaguely familiar. She was pushing a stroller. Kendall's eyes widened as she saw her ex-husband for the first time in 5 years. "Hi, Kyle," she stammered. "Hi, Kendall," he replied, dispassionately. She extended her hand towards the woman. "Hi, I'm Kendall. I used to be married to Kyle." "Oh, yes, I've heard all about you," the woman answered, shaking Kendall's hand. Kendall blushed at this. "I'm sure it's nothing good." "Something good. And some things are not so good," the woman answered. "I'm Corey Calloway. I'm Kyle's wife. This is our son, Kyle Jr." Kendall looked at the sleeping baby. The hardest thing in her life was keeping a smile on her face while looking at her ex-husband's new family. "He's a wonderful child. You are lucky to have married Kyle. He is a good man. It was good to see you again, Kyle." Kyle just looked at her contemptuously, took the woman by the hand, and, pushing the stroller, headed to the men's department. A few days later, while watching the local evening news, Kendall was shocked to discover that the news anchor was the same woman she had seen with Kyle. That's why it seemed familiar to her. Kendall Googled Corey Calloway and discovered that she was a fast-rising media talent who might end up on one of the nation's cable news channels. Local media observers have noted that while she's good enough, aka not necessarily slutty or boring enough, for Fox News, her intellect is better suited for MSNBC, although she'll have to develop a more condescending tone if she moves to that channel. In the meantime, she was extremely popular on the local news. Kendall cried herself to sleep that night, and every night for the next week, until she remembered her fantasy. Kyle was cruel and emotionally abusive, wasn't he? It was only a matter of time before his new marriage ended, too. Kendall forced herself back to the present, wondering what the divorce would mean for her. After eating an egg muffin, Kendall demanded that her parents take her to their home. "This is a bad idea, honey," her father said. "I need to talk to Dan. I have to explain to him what happened. We can work things out." "Ken," her mother began, "I don't think this is a good idea." "The judge said." "I don't care what the judge said," Kendall snapped at her mother. "Just take me home." Kendall's parents walked her to the front door and watched as she rang the doorbell. They stood and waited for a couple of minutes, and then Kendall rang the doorbell again. When nothing happened again, Kendall began banging on the door. Dan quickly made a phone call and opened the door without removing the chain. "You can't be here. There's a restraining order to keep you away." "I live here," Kendall said. "How can we fix our marriage if I'm not here?" Dan looked at Kendall incredulously. "To correct? I'm divorcing you. We won't fix anything. I am not going to stay married to a lying and cruel cheater. You need to get out of here."